Berlin in April 1945 was a city already half destroyed before the battle had even begun. 6 years of war had turned Europe into a graveyard, and the capital of the Reich now waited for the storm that all knew was coming. The air was heavy with smoke from countless raids. The streets were choked with rubble, and the people of the city lived not in homes, but in cellars, waiting for the next blow to fall. The once proud boulevards of Berlin, lined with theaters, ministries, and monuments, now stood hollow, windows blown out, statues scarred by fire. It was the twilight of the Reich. The armies that had once swept across the continent with frightening speed were shattered or destroyed. The German Empire that stretched from the Pyrenees to the Volga now shrank to a shell, clinging desperately to its capital. Adolf Hitler, who had promised 1,000 years of power, now ruled only the ruins beneath his feet. By April 1945, the war's outcome was no longer in question. In the West, the Americans and British had broken through the Rhine and raced across Germany with unstoppable momentum. Their armored columns rolled across the plains, liberating towns and capturing bridges. In the South, Allied bombers scoured the skies, raining destruction on Munich, Nuremberg, and other cities of the Reich. But it was in the East, where the war had burned with unmatched ferocity, that the final blow was preparing to fall. For nearly 4 years, the Soviet Union had borne the greatest burden of the conflict. At Stalingrad, entire armies were destroyed in the snow. At Kursk, the greatest clash of armor in history had turned German dreams of victory into retreat. At Operation Bagration in the summer of 1944, Army Group Center was annihilated, leaving Belarus and eastern Poland in Soviet hands. Each campaign pushed the Germans westward, bleeding them of men, tanks, and morale. Now, the Red Army stood at the Oder River, less than 50 miles from Berlin. Here, Stalin gathered a force without parallel in European history. More than 2.5 million soldiers, supported by 6,250 tanks, 40,000 artillery pieces, and 7,500 aircraft, assembled along the Oder-Neisse line. Supply trains stretched for miles, unloading mountains of shells and fuel. Pontoon bridges spanned rivers to carry the advancing armies forward. Engineers prepared maps and routes. Commissars reminded the troops of what had been endured. The 20 million dead left in villages, forests, and fields across the Soviet Union. The march to Berlin was not only a campaign of conquest, it was a mission of vengeance. Opposing them was a German army that scarcely deserved the name. The Wehrmacht of 1945 was no longer the professional force that had conquered Europe. Instead, Berlin's defenders were a patchwork of exhausted divisions, understrength units, hastily reformed regiments, and untrained militia. The Volkssturm, men too old or too young for military service, were armed with rifles from the last war, Panzerfausts, and little else. Hitler Youth units, some no older than 14, drilled in playgrounds and courtyards, preparing to ambush Soviet tanks with handheld rockets. In theory, nearly 800,000 men were available for the defense of Berlin. In practice, the majority were poorly armed, poorly supplied, and already defeated in spirit. For the civilians, life in Berlin had become a daily ordeal. By April, more than 70% of the city's buildings had been damaged or destroyed by Allied bombing. Food rations had collapsed, forcing many to survive on scraps and barter. Water pumps no longer functioned in many districts. Every night, families crowded into air raid shelters or the cellars of shattered homes, listening to the distant thunder of artillery moving closer each day. Refugees streamed into the city from the east, carrying stories of the Red Army's relentless advance and the horrors of occupation. Fear gripped the capital as the Soviet front drew near. And yet, despite the collapse of his armies and the despair of his people, Hitler refused to accept reality. In the depths of the Führer bunker beneath the Reich Chancellery, he raged at his generals, dismissed their reports, and gave orders to phantom divisions that no longer existed. He declared that Berlin would be defended to the last man, that retreat was forbidden, and that every street must be held as if it were a fortress. His faith rested on delusion. Imaginary armies under Field Marshal Wenck that would never arrive, secret weapons that would never be used, and loyalty that could no longer be sustained. His ministers echoed his defiance. Joseph Goebbels, the Reich's propaganda minister, urged the people to fight on. He declared Berlin would be the grave of the Soviet Union, that the city would resist as Stalingrad had resisted, that victory would be born from sacrifice. The broadcasts filled the air, but few truly believed them. The thunder of Soviet guns could already be heard in the eastern suburbs. The capital was already doomed. By early April, the Red Army began its preparations in earnest. Marshal Georgy Zhukov's First Belarusian Front massed opposite Berlin, while Marshal Ivan Konev's First Ukrainian Front prepared to strike from the south. Their instructions were simple: encircle, crush, and capture the German capital. Stalin encouraged rivalry between them, promising glory to the front that reached the Reichstag first. The plan was one of destruction, not maneuver. The final blow against Berlin would be delivered by firepower and overwhelming numbers, whatever the cost. For the Germans, there was no comparable plan. The high command was fractured, its officers fearful of Hitler's wrath, its formations already shattered. General Heinrici, tasked with defending the Oder line, knew the truth. He warned that without reserves, without fuel, and without air support, the defense could not hold. His warnings were ignored. Berlin was to be defended, not because it could be saved, but because Hitler demanded it. The stage was set. On one side, a war machine sharpened by 4 years of brutal struggle, burning with vengeance, and armed with more firepower than any army in history. On the other, a capital defended by children, militia, and remnants of once great divisions, commanded by a leader who had lost touch with reality. The world knew what was coming. The Battle of Berlin would not only decide the fate of Germany, it would close the chapter of the Second World War in Europe. By the spring of 1945, the Soviet Union had forged the most powerful army the world had ever seen. After 4 years of relentless struggle, the Red Army stood on the Oder and Neisse rivers, just 50 miles from the heart of Nazi Germany. Behind them lay the ruins of the Eastern Front, a trail of victories carved through the ashes of Stalingrad, Kursk, and Bagration. Ahead of them lay Berlin, the capital of the empire that had invaded their homeland and brought devastation to their soil. For Joseph Stalin, Berlin was more than a military objective. It was a symbol, the ultimate prize of the war. To capture the city meant to avenge the horrors inflicted upon the Soviet Union and to establish dominance over Europe in the post-war world. The Western Allies had crossed the Rhine and surged into central Germany, but Stalin had no intention of letting them take the German capital. The honor and the political leverage it brought would belong to the Red Army alone. The plan to take Berlin was vast in scale, orchestrated with the precision of a war machine that had learned through blood and loss. Stalin placed the operation in the hands of his two most capable commanders, Marshal Georgy Zhukov and Marshal Ivan Konev. Each had proven themselves in the crucible of earlier campaigns. Zhukov, the victor of Moscow and Stalingrad, was entrusted with the central thrust toward Berlin from the east. Konev, the commander of the First Ukrainian Front, was tasked with striking from the south, driving through Saxony and cutting off the capital from reinforcement. To the north, Marshal Rokossovsky's Second Belarusian Front would advance toward the Baltic, preventing German forces from regrouping. Stalin fostered rivalry between his marshals deliberately. He hinted that whichever commander reached the Reichstag first would receive the honor of raising the red flag over Berlin. Zhukov and Konev, both ambitious and fiercely proud, drove their preparations with even greater urgency. The result was a concentration of power that dwarfed anything previously seen in Europe. The numbers spoke for themselves. Zhukov's First Belarusian Front massed more than 900,000 soldiers, supported by 3,000 tanks and 16,000 artillery pieces. Konev's First Ukrainian Front deployed a similar force, over 700,000 men, nearly 2,000 tanks, and 11,000 guns. Together, the Soviets assembled a staggering total of 2.5 million troops, 6,250 tanks, 40,000 artillery pieces, and 7,500 aircraft. To put this in perspective, the Germans defending Berlin could muster at best 750,000 men, many of them poorly trained, ill-equipped, or too young or old for frontline service. The Soviet plan did not rely on finesse. It was a doctrine of annihilation, honed since the days of Stalingrad. Unleash overwhelming artillery, pound the enemy into submission, and advance with tank and infantry waves until resistance collapsed. Soviet engineers built pontoon bridges across the Oder and Neisse to carry armor and supplies. Ammunition stockpiles rose into mountains, millions of shells and rockets waiting to be fired. Trucks, horses, and rail lines carried food, fuel, and reinforcements to the front. The goal was not a clever maneuver, but an irresistible hammer blow. Within the ranks, Soviet soldiers prepared with grim determination. Letters written in the days before the offensive reveal a mixture of anticipation and vengeance. One infantryman wrote to his family, "We will not rest until Berlin is ours. Every shell that falls upon them is for the villages they burned, for the mothers they killed, for the children they left to starve." Another wrote, "Do not cry if I fall. Remember that I go to strike at the lair of the beast." For millions of Soviet soldiers, this was not merely a military campaign, it was justice. Yet the offensive carried enormous risks. Zhukov's main thrust had to cross the Oder and smash through the Silo Heights, a line of defenses commanded by General Gotthard Heinrici, one of Germany's most skilled defensive tacticians. The terrain there was treacherous, flooded lowlands that turned into quagmires under bombardment. The Germans had mined the fields, fortified the ridges, and concealed artillery in forests. Though depleted, their defensive position was formidable. Stalin's insistence on speed only increased the danger. Still, the Soviets had learned from bitter experience. In 1941, at the gates of Moscow, they had fought in desperation. At Stalingrad, they had endured unimaginable losses before triumphing. Now, in 1945, their doctrine was one of preparation and overwhelming firepower. Commanders allocated artillery at a density of 250 guns per mile of front, a storm designed to obliterate German defenses in hours. Entire air armies were assigned to soften resistance, with bombers and ground attack planes sweeping over roads and strongpoints. As the Soviets prepared, Berlin itself braced for siege. Inside the city, Joseph Goebbels promised the people that the capital would become a new Stalingrad, a fortress where the Reich would rise again. Posters declared, "Every house a fortress, every street a barricade." In reality, the defenses were brittle. The Volkssturm drilled in empty streets with weapons from the last war. Boys of the Hitler Youth carried Panzerfausts on their shoulders, their faces set in expressions of grim determination, but their bodies too frail for the task. Old men, veterans of 1914, were marched into formations, their uniforms ill-fitting, their rifles rusted. It was a force bound together by desperation, not by strength. For Hitler, the approaching storm was met with delusion. In his bunker, he spoke of General Wenck's 12th Army, insisting it would arrive to relieve the city. He ordered formations that no longer existed to counterattack. He promised his staff that Berlin would not fall, that the Reich would endure. But his words could not change reality. The noose was already tightening, and the armies he imagined were phantoms. The stage was now set. On April 16th, the greatest artillery bombardment in the history of the Eastern Front would open the final act of the war in Europe. Zhukov's armies would crash against the Silo Heights, Konev's forces would surge through Saxony, and Rokossovsky's troops would drive north. The Soviet plan of destruction was not merely about capturing a city. It was about crushing the last vestiges of Hitler's power and ending the war that had consumed the world. The fate of Berlin, and of the Reich itself would be decided in fire. On the morning of April 16, 1945, the earth itself seemed to roar. At exactly 5 a.m., the Soviet Union unleashed the most concentrated artillery bombardment Europe had ever witnessed. More than 40,000 guns, mortars, and rocket launchers opened fire at once along the Oder River front. The sound was deafening, a rolling thunder that shook the ground for miles. Entire villages vanished beneath the storm. German positions, trenches, and bunkers disappeared in a cloud of fire and dust. For half an hour, the barrage continued, pouring more than 1 million shells onto a front barely 30 miles wide. This was the opening of the Battle of the Seelow Heights, the last great defensive line before Berlin. For Marshal Georgy Zhukov and his First Belarusian Front, it was the key to the capital. If the heights could be broken, the road to Berlin would lie open. If not, the Red Army would bleed on the Oder floodplains. The German defense was commanded by General Gotthard Heinrici, one of the Wehrmacht's most skilled defensive tacticians. He had taken command of Army Group Vistula only weeks earlier, inheriting a force battered and depleted. Yet Heinrici knew how to prepare ground. Anticipating the Soviet assault, he ordered his troops to withdraw from their foremost trenches just hours before the Soviet barrage began. When the shells fell, they landed on empty positions. His main line of resistance, dug into the ridges of the Seelow Heights themselves, remained largely intact. The terrain favored the defenders. The Oder plains had been deliberately flooded by German engineers, turning fields into swamps. Soviet tanks, forced to cross in the wake of the bombardment, bogged down in mud. Infantry advanced slowly, wading waist-deep through water, while machine guns raked them from concealed bunkers. German artillery, spared by Heinrici's withdrawal, opened fire from the ridges, cutting down the first waves. The Soviets had unleashed a storm, but they now faced a wall of fire in return. Zhukov pressed his attack with characteristic determination. Entire rifle divisions were thrown forward, their banners flying, their officers driving them on. Tanks pushed through the marshes, dragging logs and planks to lay across the mud. Engineers struggled to repair bridges under constant fire. Casualties mounted quickly. One Soviet veteran recalled, "We went forward into a sea of mud and death. The artillery had promised us an easy path, but the Germans were waiting. We fell in hundreds, then thousands, and still we were told to advance." By midday, Zhukov realized the assault was faltering. He had expected a breakthrough by morning, but the German lines held. Frustrated, he committed his reserves earlier than planned. Entire tank armies were pushed into the fight, their columns stretching back for miles across the Oder. The battlefield became a chaos of mud, smoke, and wreckage. Soviet Katyusha rockets screamed overhead, their shrill howls announcing fresh barrages that shook the ridges. Still, the Germans resisted, each hill and trench becoming a fortress. For the defenders, the battle was desperate but grimly disciplined. The German Ninth Army, though outnumbered nearly 10-1, fought with the resolve of men who knew they defended the gateway to their capital. Machine gunners fired until their barrels overheated. Anti-tank crews waited until Soviet armor loomed close, then fired Panzerfausts from basements and tree lines. A German officer wrote in his diary that day, "We fight with nothing left to hold on to but duty. Every man knows Berlin is behind us. We cannot give another step." As night fell on April 16, the Soviets had gained only a few miles. Zhukov's casualties were staggering, tens of thousands killed or wounded in a single day. Yet he refused to relent. On April 17th, the barrage was repeated, this time even heavier. Soviet troops surged forward again, and again they were repulsed. The floodplains swallowed tanks whole. Soviet infantry fell in waves against machine guns hidden in forests and gullies. The battle became one of attrition, with Soviet numbers grinding against German defenses like water eroding stone. By April 18th, the pressure began to tell. German lines buckled under constant assault. Heinrich's reserves were nearly exhausted, and every village, every hilltop became a battlefield. Soviet units bypassed strongpoints, leaving them to be reduced later. Engineers laid bridges across swamps under artillery fire, while medics carried wounded men back through seas of mud. The air reeked of smoke and death. Survivors recalled the groans of the wounded carrying across the night, mingled with the distant roar of Soviet artillery firing without pause. On April 19th, the German defense finally collapsed. Soviet armor, pouring through breaches in the lines, broke onto the plateau of the Silo Heights. Fighting was savage and close, house to house, bunker to bunker. But by nightfall, the heights were in Soviet hands. Heinrich ordered a withdrawal westward, knowing that his army had no choice but to fall back toward Berlin itself. The cost was immense. Zhukov's first Belarusian front suffered more than 30,000 dead and 70,000 wounded in just 4 days of battle. Hundreds of tanks were destroyed, and entire rifle regiments had been cut to pieces. Yet, the gateway to Berlin was open. Soviet losses that might once have halted an offensive were now accepted as the price of final victory. For Zhukov, the blood spent at Silo was justified by the prize ahead. For the Germans, the loss of the heights was the breaking point. The last natural line of defense east of the capital was gone. The remnants of the Ninth Army withdrew in disorder, harried by Soviet tanks and artillery. Berlin now lay naked before the Red Army. The battle for the Silo Heights stands as a testament to the ferocity of the war's final days. It was a clash where preparation and desperation met overwhelming force, where courage and sacrifice could delay but not prevent defeat. A Soviet soldier later wrote, "We lost so many that the ground seemed made of bodies. But when we looked west and saw Berlin, we knew why we had come this far." On April the 20th, Adolf Hitler's 56th birthday, Soviet guns began to shell the city itself. The thunder that had once been distant now fell upon Berlin. The capital of the Reich, battered and burning, had entered its final battle. With the Silo Heights shattered, the road to Berlin lay open. Soviet spearheads surged forward, their columns pouring westward in an unstoppable tide. The once orderly German defenses crumbled into chaos. Units withdrew in fragments, bridges collapsed behind them, and the Oder line became nothing more than a memory. Now the Red Army drove directly toward the German capital, determined to complete the circle. By April the 21st, Soviet forward patrols had reached the eastern suburbs of Berlin. For the first time, shells fell within the city limits. Explosions tore open apartment blocks, tram lines, and factories. The sound of war, once heard only in the distance, now shook Berlin itself. Civilians, who for months had lived under the shadow of air raids, now faced the thunder of artillery rolling ceaselessly from the east. Stalin's plan for encirclement was precise and merciless. Zhukov's first Belarusian front pressed directly from the east, battering through the suburbs and highways that led straight into the city center. To the south, Marshal Konev's first Ukrainian front surged through Brandenburg, tearing into the last formations of the German Ninth Army. Their mission was to cut Berlin off from the southwest and prevent any hope of relief. To the north, Marshal Rokossovsky's second Belarusian front advanced toward the Baltic coast, smashing German defenses in Pomerania and preventing reinforcement from that quarter. By April 25th, the Soviet pincers met west of Berlin, closing the ring. The capital of the Reich was completely encircled. At the same time, farther west, another meeting carried symbolic weight. Near the small town of Torgau on the Elbe River, Soviet and American soldiers encountered each other on April 25th. The handshake on the ruined bridge became one of the most famous images of the war. For the German Reich, it meant the country was cut in half. For the Allies, it marked the collapse of the enemy they had fought for so long. The war in Europe was nearing its end, but for Berlin, the worst was yet to come. Inside the city, nearly 3 million civilians remained trapped. Many had no chance to flee. The roads were blocked, the railways destroyed, and the encirclement sealed every path outward. Refugees crowded into schools, churches, and government buildings, carrying only what they could hold in their hands. Food was scarce, rations had collapsed. Bread, potatoes, and meat could scarcely be found. Families subsisted on turnips, nettles, or whatever could be bartered on the black market. Clean water became a luxury as pipes were shattered by bombardment. Every day, the wounded crowded the cellars of hospitals that no longer had bandages or medicine.
The psychological weight of the encirclement was crushing. Thousands of Berliners, hearing stories of Soviet vengeance from the east, chose suicide rather than face what was coming. Entire families gathered in apartments and cellars, ending their lives together. For others, survival became a desperate act of endurance. One witness recalled, "We could hear the guns all day and all night. We did not know if the next shell would find our house. We lived in fear and in silence, waiting." The defense of the city fell to General Helmuth Weidling, appointed commander of the Berlin defense area in late April.
A disciplined and competent officer, Weidling knew his task was hopeless. On paper, he commanded nearly 750,000 troops, but in reality this was a phantom figure. Perhaps half that number were actually present, and even fewer were combat-ready. The force was a patchwork of Wehrmacht remnants, Waffen-SS detachments, police units, Hitler Youth, and Volkssturm militia. Some divisions consisted of little more than a few thousand men with inadequate arms. Ammunition was desperately short. Fuel for tanks and vehicles was almost gone. The Luftwaffe had been reduced to a handful of aircraft, unable to challenge Soviet dominance of the skies. Still, Weidling attempted to impose order. He divided the city into 8 defense sectors, each commanded by officers who pledged to resist to the last. Barricades were built across boulevards, anti-tank ditches dug in parks, and firing positions carved into basements and rooftops. The plan was to transform Berlin into a fortress, where every street would be contested, every building defended. Goebbels proclaimed to the people that Berlin would become another Stalingrad, a city of sacrifice that would inspire future generations. But the comparison was hollow. The Wehrmacht in 1942 had been supplied, organized, and fighting far from its homeland. Berlin in 1945 was starving, crumbling, and encircled. Its soldiers were exhausted remnants, its civilians broken. What Goebbels called a fortress was in truth a prison. In the Führer bunker beneath the Reich Chancellery, Hitler refused to acknowledge reality. He issued orders to divisions that no longer existed, imagining relief from General Wenck's 12th Army, which was in no position to reach the city. He raged against his generals, accusing them of cowardice and betrayal. His world had narrowed to the bunker maps, with red arrows closing from every side. Yet, even as the noose tightened, he declared Berlin would stand. Retreat was forbidden. Every man, woman, and child was to fight where they stood. For the Soviets, the encirclement was executed with brutal efficiency. Artillery batteries encircled the city in a ring of fire, pounding it day and night. Rocket launchers lit the skies with shrieking salvos. Tanks pushed into the outskirts, systematically reducing resistance with cannon fire and flamethrowers. From every direction, the circle drew tighter, cutting off each pocket of defenders, severing every escape route. By April 25th, the situation was irreversible. Berlin was surrounded. The last communications to the outside world faltered. Supplies could not enter. Reinforcements could not arrive. The capital of Hitler's empire, once the center of a continent-wide dominion, now stood alone in a wasteland of ruin. The encirclement was more than a military maneuver. It was the final act of inevitability. For the Red Army, the fall of Berlin was no longer a question of if, but when. For the defenders, the encirclement meant that every shot fired, every order given, every life lost was part of a doomed last stand. The capital of the Third Reich had become the stage for its final tragedy. By April 23, 1945, the city of Berlin had become the battlefield itself. The Soviet encirclement was complete, and now the Red Army pressed inward from every side. What had once been a city of great boulevards, monuments, and theaters was reduced to rubble and smoke. The thunder of artillery never ceased. Shells tore through apartment blocks, government ministries, and bridges. Streets were filled with debris, cratered by explosions and blocked by the wreckage of trams and vehicles. Smoke and dust cloaked the air, turning daylight into a haze. Berlin, the capital of Hitler's Reich, was no longer a city of life. It was a fortress of ruins, a place where every corner became a battlefield. Marshal Zhukov's first Belarusian front struck from the east, advancing along the Frankfurter Alley toward the heart of the city. Marshal Konev's first Ukrainian front pressed from the south, converging through Tempelhof and Neukölln. From every direction, Soviet formations pushed relentlessly toward the center. Their numbers and firepower were overwhelming, but progress was far from easy. The shattered city landscape slowed their tanks to a crawl. Rubble, barricades, and shell craters turned every street into a trap. Armor could no longer sweep forward in open formation. Instead, tanks advanced in small groups, firing directly into buildings at point-blank range. Infantry followed closely behind, storming stairwells, clearing cellars, and flushing snipers from rooftops with grenades and flamethrowers. The German defense, though doomed, fought with savage determination. Waffen-SS units manned intersections and strongpoints with machine guns and mortars, turning every corner into a killing zone. Volkssturm militia, men too old or too young for the front, crouched in doorways with Panzerfausts, ready to ambush Soviet armor. Boys of the Hitler Youth, many only 14 or 15 years old, carried rifles too heavy for their shoulders but threw themselves into the fight with reckless courage. Foreign volunteers of the Waffen-SS from France, the Netherlands, and Scandinavia resisted alongside them, fighting to the death for an ideology that was already collapsing in ashes. For many, it was no longer about victory. It was about buying time, delaying the inevitable, or dying in the ruins of the Reich. The Soviets adapted to the brutal urban warfare with ruthless efficiency. Heavy artillery was dragged into the city itself, positioned in streets and squares to blast through entire blocks. IS-2 heavy tanks, their massive guns designed to pierce Tiger armor, now fired directly into buildings, collapsing walls onto defenders. Katyusha rockets shrieked overhead, saturating entire neighborhoods in waves of fire. Flamethrowers scoured bunkers and tunnels, filling the underground with fire and smoke. Engineers blew apart barricades with explosives, clearing paths for infantry to advance. The city was not conquered with maneuver, but with annihilation, position by position, building by building, street by street. For the civilians of Berlin, the battle was an apocalypse. Families huddled in basements, the walls trembling with every impact. Food was gone. Water had to be drawn from wells or melted snow. The wounded crowded into cellars, hospitals that no longer had supplies or power.
Entire families were crushed beneath collapsing buildings or incinerated in firestorms. Some chose to end their lives before the Red Army reached them. Suicide became a daily occurrence. Men, women, and children gathering in apartments, swallowing poison, or turning weapons upon themselves. Neighbors would emerge from shelters to find bodies hanging from lampposts or lying motionless on staircases. Those who survived spoke later of a silence broken only by artillery and screams, of a fear so constant that time itself seemed to dissolve. One Berliner later wrote, "We no longer feared death. We only feared living another day in that hell." Yet the city continued to resist.
In the government quarter, SS units fortified ministries, embassies, and the Reichstag, turning monumental stone buildings into strongholds. Machine guns fired from shattered windows, anti-tank weapons from courtyards, snipers from rooftops. The Reich Chancellery itself was transformed into a fortress, with sandbags, barricades, and tunnels linking one building to another. Hitler's bodyguards, along with remnants of elite Waffen-SS divisions, prepared for the final defense. In the midst of destruction, propaganda still proclaimed that Berlin would not fall, that miracles and secret weapons would bring salvation. The fighting intensified as Soviet armies pressed toward the center. By April 26th, they reached Alexanderplatz and the Tiergarten, pressing closer to the Reichstag and the Chancellery. The Spree River crossings became scenes of desperate struggle. Bridges were defended at point-blank range. When destroyed, Soviet engineers built new crossings under fire. Tanks fought among the ruins of the Tiergarten, their turrets swiveling between shattered trees and burning vehicles. The city's parks, squares, and boulevards became killing fields. The climax of the struggle came in the assault on the Reichstag. The great building, once the symbol of German power, had been heavily fortified. Inside, SS and Volkssturm defenders barricaded corridors, set up machine guns, and prepared for their last stand. On April 29th, Soviet troops closed in. The bombardment was relentless. Artillery shells crashed into the stone facade, while tanks fired directly into its walls. On April 30th, Soviet infantry stormed the building. The fighting inside was savage and chaotic. Grenades exploded in chambers once filled with speeches. Soldiers grappled hand-to-hand in stairwells. Smoke filled the Great Hall as Soviet troops pushed forward floor by floor. Hours of bloody combat followed. At last, a group of soldiers reached the roof. Amid smoke and ruin, they raised the red banner over the dome of the Reichstag. The moment, captured later in a staged photograph, became the defining symbol of Soviet victory and the fall of Nazi Germany. The flag flew above a city reduced to rubble, a triumph marked by devastation. But even as the banner waved, fighting raged on in the streets below. Resistance in the Chancellery, in bunkers, and in isolated strongpoints continued. Some units fought to the last man. Others surrendered only when their ammunition was gone. For the Soviets, progress came at a heavy price. The Red Army lost thousands of men in the final days of street fighting. Entire battalions were bled white in the push to capture a single block or a single building. For many soldiers, the victory was hollow, purchased with the lives of comrades who had fought with them since Stalingrad or Kursk. Inside the Führer bunker, Hitler received word that the Reichstag had fallen. The sound of Soviet artillery shook the walls overhead. His empire had collapsed into a few burning streets. In those final hours, the battle for Berlin had become not just a military struggle, but a descent into ruin and despair.
By May 1st, resistance began to collapse in earnest. Commanders realized further defense was impossible. Ammunition was gone, food exhausted, soldiers broken. Thousands laid down their weapons and marched into Soviet captivity. Others fled into the ruins, hoping to disappear. Still others chose suicide rather than surrender. For the people of Berlin, survival meant enduring the aftermath as the Red Army swept through the city, bringing both liberation and terror. On May 2nd, General Helmuth Weidling, commander of the Berlin defense area, surrendered the city to the Soviets. After 2 weeks of the most savage urban battle in history, the capital of the Reich had fallen.
Berlin was silent, its ruins still smoking, its streets filled with the dead and the dispossessed. The inferno was over. The battle for Berlin was not only the collapse of an empire, it was the final demonstration of total war, where civilians and soldiers alike were consumed in fire. For the Soviets, it was vengeance fulfilled. For the Germans, it was catastrophe complete. For the world, it was the closing chapter of a conflict that had scarred the 20th century forever. By the final days of April 1945, Berlin was burning above ground and collapsing below. The thunder of Soviet artillery shook the city without pause, reducing entire neighborhoods to rubble. Fires consumed blocks where families had once lived, and bridges lay shattered across the Spree. Tanks moved among the ruins of the Tiergarten, their turrets swinging left and right as they fired into collapsing buildings. The Reich was gone in all but name, but in the depths of the Führer bunker, Adolf Hitler continued to believe in salvation that would never come. The Führer bunker lay beneath the Reich Chancellery Gardens, a concrete labyrinth buried under layers of steel and earth. Its corridors were lit with electric lamps that flickered as bombs fell above. Air was heavy with smoke and sweat. The men and women who sheltered there lived in a twilight world, cut off from the reality outside. To Hitler, reports of the city's collapse were filtered through rage and delusion. He spoke of phantom armies marching to Berlin's rescue, of counterattacks that could never be launched, of betrayals that explained every failure, but never his own. On April the 22nd, during one of his last military conferences, Hitler erupted in fury, acknowledging for the first time that the war was lost. He accused his generals of cowardice and incompetence, screamed of betrayal, and declared that Germany had failed him. Witnesses described him slumping in despair, muttering that all was finished. Yet, hours later he returned to defiance, insisting that Berlin would still hold, that he would never leave his capital, that he would fight and die where he stood. In those last days, the bunker became a stage for ritual and fantasy. On April 29th, with Soviet shells crashing overhead, Hitler married Eva Braun, his companion of more than a decade. The ceremony was brief, witnessed only by a handful of loyal staff. Later that night, he dictated his political testament. In it, he raged against the Jews, blamed his generals for the loss of the war, and appointed successors who would never rule.
Even in his last words, there was no reflection, no admission of guilt, only bitterness and blame. The next day, April 30th, he made his final decision. He had told those close to him that he would not allow himself to be captured, that he would not be paraded by his enemies as a prize of war. Around 3 in the afternoon, Hitler and Eva Braun withdrew into his private chambers. Outside, aides and secretaries waited in silence. Moments later, a single gunshot echoed through the corridor. When the door was opened, Hitler lay dead from a self-inflicted wound to the head. Eva Braun had swallowed poison. Their bodies were carried into the Chancellery Garden, doused with petrol, and set alight as Soviet shells landed nearby. The flames consumed the man who had led Germany into ruin, leaving behind only ashes in the rubble of his capital. Inside the bunker, those who remained faced the end in their own ways. Some fled into the ruins above, attempting to break through Soviet lines. Few succeeded. Others took their own lives in imitation of the dictator they had served. Among them was Joseph Goebbels, who poisoned his 6 children and then died with his wife in the ruins of the Chancellery. The air underground grew quieter as more doors were closed.
More chambers left in silence. The empire that had once commanded a continent now existed only in a bunker filled with despair. Above ground, the last defenders of Berlin fought on. SS units held the government quarter with ferocity, but their numbers were collapsing. Ammunition was nearly gone, food exhausted, and commanders could no longer control the chaos. By May 1st, resistance was fragmenting into isolated pockets. Soldiers surrendered in groups, their weapons thrown onto piles in the streets. Civilians wandered among them, searching for water, searching for shelter, searching for hope. On May 2nd, General Helmut Weidling, commander of the Berlin defense area, accepted that further resistance was pointless. He issued the order for all German forces in the city to lay down their arms. That morning, Soviet commanders received the unconditional surrender of Berlin. The battle was over. For the soldiers who survived, the surrender meant captivity. Tens of thousands were marched eastward into Soviet camps, their fates uncertain. For the civilians, it meant a new ordeal under occupation. For the world, it meant the end of Hitler's Reich. The dictator who had once ruled Europe with fire and terror ended his life in a bunker, his empire in ruins above him. The Reich he promised would last 1,000 years had endured only 12. In the ashes of Berlin, it came to its end.